Welcome to our annual 360 Stratcom event. My name is Urumqi, and I'm the Senior Director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council.
And I'm Rose Jackson, Director of the DFR Lab's Democracy and Tech Initiative. We're thrilled to be back here this year for an exciting day of programming focused on how governments are working to drive forward a proactively democratic tech agenda.
When we gathered here for Stratcom last December, DFR Lab was starting to document Russia's military buildup around Ukraine, which was happening in broad daylight and verifiable using sources open to all who were watching. Now, we're 10 months into an active war of aggression perpetrated by Russia on European soil. It's a kinetic war in which digital ecosystems and tech policy are a theater of the conflict in ways that will set precedent for years to come, both in war and in peace.
Since last year, we've seen democracies seem to come to a more serious and proactive appreciation of the systemic nature of the internet and the rising stakes for the future of it around the world.
Democracies have re-engaged the multinational and multi-stakeholder bodies of their own making and reinvigorated diplomatic engagement on everything from semiconductors and supply chains to data flows and transparency standards.
While that all may sound kind of semantic, here's why it matters. The internet is systemic. Even as we talk about digital sovereignty and dueling internets, the fact is that the underlying technology our digital world is built on is connective. And the information ecosystem that sits on top of that is inherently referential and linked together. In fact, it's global.
Countries with strong viewpoints on how digital ecosystems should be funded, built, and governed already have an outsized impact on our day-to-day lives, which will only continue to grow.
Now, whether you care about that because it means there's a market to compete in, or because you want to ensure that all people have the right and capacity to express their viewpoints, you have an interest in democracies leveraging their collective power in the ITU.
Which stands for the International Telecommunications Union.
The IGF.
The Internet Governance Forum.
The UN.
Of course, the United Nations.
The G7.
The Group of 7.
Okay, the G20.
Seeing a trend here, the Group of 20.
Okay, and an unending number of acronyms that we created to ensure that the internet is governed collectively by industry, civil society, and countries.
And if that's not enough of an argument for you to tune in today, know that authoritarian countries are clear-eyed about the opportunities this digital ecosystem provides to extend and project their interests and power on the world stage.
DFR Lab's resident fellow for China, Kenton Thibaut, recently released a fascinating report on how the CCP talks about its worldview and intentions in the digital space. What stood out for me was that China's leading scholars assessed that the US and its allies owed much of their power and success to the global world order built on the concept of universal human rights. The CCP believed that it was a powerful strategy that, try though they might, was pretty hard to break.
And so China set out to find topical and regional areas where they might build their own version of universal and interlocking global strategy. What they landed on was that the West was asleep on technology and vulnerable in the developing world, especially the global majority or global South.
So they spent the last decade actively participating in governing and standard-setting bodies, driving mutually reinforcing industrial and commercial strategies, and spending real time focused on narrative and the information environment targeting the majority world specifically. This all while building a surveillance state at home dependent on technological advances spurred by its engagement with the world.
Meanwhile, the democratic world has been slow to build a cohesive approach with recognition of what exactly is at stake. And now some argue the US in particular should just accept an end to an open internet. The democratic world's response to the authoritarian approach, which explicitly is designed to build an alternative world order at odds with universal rights, cannot be to abandon what even China has assessed to be the strength of that rights-based system.
This is good news. We have the tools and capacity as a community of small d Democrats the world over to bring our digital world into a more truly inclusive version of our universal aspirations. And at the same time, we'd be wrong to overstate the success of the authoritarian approach. They're facing challenges too, spurred in part by the reminder of just how universal the values and aspirations we're talking about are.
For example, over the last 2 weeks in China, we've seen historic protests in response to a zero-COVID policy underpinned by massive state surveillance systems and information suppression.
Or in Iran, the response to the death of a young woman named Masha Amini at the hands of state security services inspiring mass protest. Iran's response to quell the unrest has been deadly, but its efforts to silence domestic and international voices online hasn't worked.
And in the meantime, democracies are slowly retaking the spaces through which the digital world is shaped. At the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, one of the most important standard-setting bodies for the internet, democracies rallied around the candidacy of Doreen Bogdan-Martin, a respected expert with a long track record fighting for internet access for all, who now leads the organization.
The European Union passed what amounts to the most consequential rewriting of the rules of the internet in a generation, setting a precedent for democratically aligned tech governance with the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act.
Countries are leveraging efforts like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council to drive real outcomes while pushing forward important domestic pieces of the puzzle, whether that's the US CHIPS Act, the US Inflation Reduction Act, or the EU's Green New Deal.
Simultaneously, governments got organized, creating new offices and teams capable of driving coordinated action on all these fronts, whether that's the US's new Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau at the State Department, or the growing number of global tech ambassadors, including a new one from the EU who we'll hear from today.
Listen, these developments really matter, but there is so much more for democracies to do in driving forward a more rights-respecting and prosperous future.
Today's program teases some of these themes out, looking specifically at how the US and the EU are approaching the task. You're going to hear today about the recent lockdown protests in China.
We're chatting with the drafters of the European Union's landmark Digital Services and Digital Markets Acts.
We've got a big section on a decade-old democratic tech alliance, the Freedom Online Coalition. We're honored to be joined by the Canadian Deputy Foreign Minister and the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor to introduce that conversation, and a stellar civil society panel digging into what the body is and how it can live up to its promise.
And finally, we've got the first Deputy National Cyber Director, Camille Stewart-Gloucester, here to talk about their new office and what it means to have an inclusive and capable workforce in and out of government.
Now, we've already mentioned one of our major reports from this year about China, but we wanted to also encourage you to look around the Stratcom website for some of our other pieces. This includes one we're publishing today that provides an introduction to the Freedom Online Coalition, laying out its history, its structure, and operations for those newer to it.
You can find these, along with all the other research and investigations the DFR Lab has done this year, on the Digital Forensic Research Lab section of the Atlantic Council's website or on our Medium page. We're very, very online.
Before we get started, since we're so online, we hope that you'll tune in throughout the day. And as a reminder, you can find the full agenda on the 360 Stratcom website, which I assume you're watching right now.
You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn for updates through our handle @DFR Lab. And we really hope that you'll add to the conversation, post questions, and send your thoughts across all of those platforms using the hashtag 360Stratcom, and tagging us at the DFR Lab, of course.
Now let's get down to business. First up for this year's Stratcom is a conversation on the recent lockdown protests that spread across China in the last few weeks. To help us make sense of these events and how information flows within and around China, we've got a stellar panel for you.
I'm pleased to pass this off to our own Kenton Thibaut, DFR Lab's resident fellow for China and expert on the CCP's approach to the digital world, who will get us started. Over to you, Kenton.
Last weekend, large protests sprang up in cities across China. The protests seemed sparked by the news that a fire in a residential building in Xinjiang had killed at least 10 people, who were purportedly unable to escape the blaze due to the region's strict lockdowns. People took to the streets to protest in cities across the country and in almost 80 universities in China, organizing despite the government's heavy control over social media and the internet. Protesters sang the Internationale and China's national anthem while demanding an end to China's zero COVID policy. Some protesters demanded that China's Communist Party and President Xi Jinping step down. Some university protesters also called for universal rights, while others held up blank sheets of paper, which symbolized their lack of freedom of expression. News that protesters are being identified and detained via China's surveillance mechanisms has come out as the state weighs how seriously to crack down on dissent and is rolling out adjustments to its COVID policies. So, what are we to make of these protests? Why should we care about what happens inside of China? And what, if anything, does it mean for discussions of technology and democracy? I'm joined here by three experts who will hopefully be able to shed some light on these questions and help us know what to make of all of this. So first, we have Maya Wang, the Associate Director for the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. Next is Dr. Sheena Greitens, an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directs UT's Asia Policy program. Last, but certainly not least, is Xiao Qiang, a research scientist at Berkeley School of Information and the founder and editor-in-chief of China Digital Times, a bilingual China news website. A note, I'll be directing questions to the panelists, but invite them to jump in at any time to add on or respond to the points others have raised. So first, Maya, I'd like to start with you and your view of how we should be looking at these protests. Your original research on China's use of technology for mass surveillance helped to galvanize international attention on these developments in China and globally. So can you give us a lay of the land of what's going on, what are the nature of these protests, and how we should be looking at this?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm honored to be here today. What you described at the beginning of our session is a very good overview of what's been going on in China. Is that after 3 years of very strict COVID controls, some of which are, so draconian that has led to deaths because people lack medical care and, basic necessities, people in China have had enough. And that kind of bottled up energy after these 3 years essentially exploded after not just the fire in Urumqi, but also because of a series of other tragedies like a bus carrying people off to forceful quarantine had essentially had an accident and killed those some of those on board. There has been another, a single person protest in Beijing that grabbed widespread attention. And that protester had a banner that essentially linked the COVID controls to Xi Jinping's repressive rule. These events kind of lay the groundwork. At the time when it happened, people were very outraged, or people were very interested in the protest, the Longman protest. But they didn't, it led to protests at the time, but they kind of bottled up. And when the fire happened in Urumqi, and after people have had 3 years of lockdown, every urbanite in China's worst fear for the last 3 years, when they are locked down at home, where their doors are shut from outside by authorities with metal chains and iron rods and whatnot. Every urbanite in China have had that fear of dying in fire. It doesn't matter. You could be a lawyer, you could be earning a lot of money, you could be anyone, and you could be suffering the same fate. So I would say that Urumqi fire really touched a nerve in a very in a way that everybody could understand. And that led to the current wave of protest. Unfortunately, the protests, although they concerned the fire victims in Urumqi, and there has been a lot of expression of solidarity with those victims, they are not about people in China showing solidarity with the Uyghurs regarding crimes against humanity, targeting Uyghurs. So I think that has to be made clear as we discuss these protests.
Yes, thank you so much, Maya. And on the note of Xinjiang, Sheena, I'd like to turn to you. So the recent round of protests, as we've said, was galvanized by this news of a fire at a residential building in Urumqi. Can you speak a bit to why maybe Xinjiang was the catalyst for this round of protests? And maybe a bit broader, since you've written so much on this, how, if at all, does this fit in with our understanding of the role that Xinjiang plays in China's security state?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. So let me take the second question first, and then come back to this point about the role of Xinjiang specifically. First, I think this was a really interesting moment if you're looking at it from the eyes of the party state. Really interesting test of the security apparatus that Xi Jinping has now spent his first 2 terms trying to build. National security, which is really, when Xi Jinping talks about it, regime security and the security of the party leadership. Has been a huge priority for Xi Jinping over the course of the past 10 years. And we saw that really elevated and codified in the text of the 20th Party Congress work report. So then it's really interesting after that, almost immediately, to see sort of multiple Well, let me go back actually and say that that whole model of social control and regime security is aimed at what Xi Jinping calls prevention and control, which is a buzzword that's been applied both to the management of potential social unrest and to the zero COVID policies that China's adopted since 2020. And so the idea of that is to be hyper preventive and to really prevent dissent and protest and collective action from emerging at all. So it was really interesting and I imagine troubling from the standpoint of China's leaders to see that model fail initially at multiple places, multiple cities in China when these protests broke out. So if I was Xi Jinping and I was looking at his own extraordinarily sort of draconian standards for prevention and control of dissent and of social unrest, I'm not sure I would be pleased with the performance of the security state that Xi Jinping has built. So I think that there's going to be some interesting questions on how the party state and China's own internal security officials reflect on their performance and what they do. Now, I don't think that means that the system overall has failed. The capabilities they've built are still very useful for interrupting protests that are continuing and frankly being retributive or punishing people who participated or were standing behind megaphones in the last week or two. So I don't want to sort of sound like I think the system completely failed, but if I was looking at it from the standpoint of the kind of performance that Xi Jinping has signaled and communicated that he expects, I'm not sure that I would be satisfied with the security apparatus's performance this week. The reason that Xinjiang matters in that is that Xinjiang has been a sort of test case and really high priority for Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept. One of the goals of the sort of security approach that Xi Jinping has taken is to prevent protest and grievance and mobilization from connecting or spreading across locations, across classes or sectors of society within China and among the Chinese people, and also across ethnicities. And the party state has spent a lot of time framing Xinjiang and framing Uyghur dissent and dissatisfaction as a violent threat to the safety of the rest of the Chinese population, particularly the 90% Han majority. And so, and that's intended to sort of atomize and prevent cross-communal and cross-ethnic solidarity and collective action. And so what was particularly interesting and striking, but probably also concerning to China's leadership and to its policing and sort of repressive apparatus, is exactly that we've seen so many expressions of solidarity. Zero COVID has given people a point of commonality in opposition to the party state. And we've seen things like citizens in Shanghai and elsewhere in Eastern China saying, we are all Xinjiang people. And so that it's both sort of ironic and fitting that a place that has been the heart of some of the most intense, most horrific repression by the party state is also sort of the catalyst for this now, nationwide pushback. And that seems both ironic because it is the thing the party state has worked really hard to prevent. But there also seems to be some sort of in some senses, it seems very fitting and appropriate that Xinjiang should be, and that this particular tragedy actually would get people's attention and would create that kind of solidarity across the country that we haven't seen much of with the measures that have been targeted specifically at the Uyghur population before. So it is a really interesting development, and I think there's probably a lot still there to watch. And it'll be fascinating to see if that dynamic in particular continues.
Great, thank you so much. And speaking of, these mechanisms of prevention and control, I'd like to turn to Xiao Qiang. You founded China Digital Times to focus on news items which are blocked, deleted, or suppressed by China's state censors. What are some of the trends you're seeing coming out of the protests? And kind of speaking to what Sheena was talking about this kind of inter-ethnic solidarity, are these protests different in any substantial way than those that we see kind of appearing periodically in China? And then kind of a follow-up question to this is, how do protesters get information out, see information, and organize under these repressive conditions?
Well, first of all, let me say that this round of protests started from one man about a little bit more than 1 month ago. Maya mentioned it before, the lone protester, we call him Bridge Man. We actually know his name. His name is Peng Lifa. He's a self-made scientist. Put a large banners in the middle of the day in Beijing, and right before Xi Jinping officially basically crowning himself as a lifelong leader, but extending his third term, unprecedented third term at the party congress, right days before, with the banner, if everybody remembers, says following, right? We want the food, no PCR test, right? Freedom, not lockdowns, dignity, not lies, reform, not cultural revolution, elections, not rulers, to be citizens, not slaves, and with a large banner saying, remove the dictator Xi Jinping. 1 month later, these slogans are actually being shouted out throughout China in those crowds. That is really remarkable, that when some crowds, like protesters in Chengdu or in some campus, when they shout, we don't want PCR tests, we want freedom. When the people in Beijing saying, we don't want an emperor, we want a democracy, they are all anchoring his voice, who's spoken for everyone. The dictator himself is the biggest uniter of this whole movement, nationwide movement. Answer your second question. It is so significant. It's so different than any previous ones in the last 30-some years, because this time it's not just anti-zero COVID. It's anti-censorship, because people criticizing, people voicing, people put their miseries, sharing, it's all being deleted and censored on Chinese social media. You cannot say anything that people have to go on the street. All you need to do is holding on a blank sheet of paper that already said everything. And then it's anti-Xi directly. Xi made the zero COVID policy is his signature policy. He's so wedded into this. He thought that's his legitimacy, his biggest achievement until a year ago. Now his biggest disaster. And no, don't forget this. The Chinese people actually do not want another lifelong emperor. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't really want it. Xi imposed this thing on everybody through his two terms, intensified the crackdown, surveillance everyone, including the party officials, creating those apparatus. And no matter how preemptive it is, by this point, through the misery of the injury he done to the people's lives throughout the country, that generated this nationwide sentiment finally erupt. Let me answer your final question. What's the information control and the Great Firewall and all the censorship machines played here? First of all, the domestic censorship mechanism are being overwhelmed by those protesters' messages, particularly videos. Remember, China has more than 1 billion smartphones. Everybody has one. That's their electronic shackle, as a matter of fact. As a surveillance machine, everybody carries it, and the state directly have access to their personal information and where they are about, and through this QR code called health code. It's in such a totalitarian sort of under that mechanism. But when you overcome that fear, particularly the young generation, then the cell phone, smartphone become their weapon. If you notice those protesters' images, everyone holding up their smartphone as a weapon, taking pictures and videos to the police and spreading those ones, immediately overwhelm the domestic censorship mechanism. Well, the mechanism is still working, wiping them out, but the Great Firewall has a significant hole, have significant leak. There's on a daily basis at least multi-million people using different kind of VPNs and circumvention tools that are using Telegraph, for example, and those videos in the real time being deposited into the telegraph, and being transmitted to Twitter, to social media outside of China, such as YouTube, and even one single Twitter, who is totally amateur, a Chinese 30 years old living in Italy, get those videos, all these videos, and he's like so fast to republishing them, repost on the Twitter, and then the people were moving those videos immediately back to China, so the people in the city almost on a real time knows where the protesters are. So even the Chinese state media never report anything. Even the international media can only cover Beijing and Shanghai. But across China, across 80 campuses, across multiple big cities, those videos and messages are almost in real time spread out, both through in and out of the Great Firewall, and to sort of overwhelming the censorship machine temporarily spread out the whole country. And that's how the movement started. The Xi Jinping, the censorship machine, and the Great Firewall, at least during that couple of days, didn't do the job they're supposed to do. Okay, or let me put it this way: Xi Jinping is an incompetent dictator, including his repression machine, and that's simply is a fact. I just want to end up to say, the anti-COVID protest, the zero COVID protest, the anti-censorship, and anti-Xi to be the lifelong leader is the same message throughout this protest. The political message cannot be separated from this anti-zero COVID reaction. And Xi heard that. That's why you see this immediate relax of the COVID, but same time, of course, he will repress all the demonstrations and political dissent. But let's see how far he can hold on this.
Yes, and speaking of, how zero COVID was kind of the galvanizer that, allowed this kind of wave of protests to happen. Maya, I'll direct this question to you, but would welcome, all of the panelists to opine on this. Where do the protests go from here? Will most of the public anger be diffused with these, adjustments to the COVID policy that we're seeing come out of China now? And what will happen to the organizers of the protests? And do we think these modest adjustments are, temporary? How do we think China's going to respond when, the death rates start to rise as lockdown lifts? So Maya, I'm directing that at you, but would welcome our other panelists to give their opinions on this as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for this question, because I really want to push back on the very question itself. Is that I think often, especially I think in the West, every time we see protests in places like Iran or in China, or any number of protests in the last couple of years, there have been many. The question is often like, after the protests essentially kind of wind down, and people kind of basically ask, is that it? is that all there is? Or is the status quo essentially prevails? Is all what the government has to do is these minor adjustments, and people would be essentially appeased? I think that's a wrong question, because even in the West, you go out to protest about, I don't know, the climate or women's rights. Things don't change overnight, and why would we expect that in the most authoritarian of governments like China, that have spent decades in building is, social control machinery, that the regime would somehow just like crumble from that? I think that underestimates, the power of these governments, and it kind of asks an unfair question of these movements. Now, I think Xiao Qiang have set the stage very well, is that these movements are essentially, call and responses through time and through space, right? Xiao Qiang himself was became an activist after 1989, the authorities, Tiananmen massacre back then, and has, set up, China Digital Times, which have continued to play a very central role today, reporting information on China, and essentially people in China also read the CDT and get, inspired and learned. So to ask whether or not these protests are going to fizzle out is to miss kind of the essential historical arc of China or any authoritarian governments. China has had difficulties after the fall of the Qing dynasty 100 years ago. And at the time, people, intellectuals, ordinary people were fighting for essentially the same things, democracy and freedoms, and grappling with how to reconcile China's, deep traditions of various different kinds with modernity. And I think that struggle continues. Now, the protests are important this time because they give people hope that they're not alone. For the last 10 years or so since Xi Jinping came to power in particular, I think people have felt incredibly lonely if they support human rights or democracy. It gives people a sense of solidarity among themselves, between groups. I think both Sheena and Xiao Qiang have discussed that. Solidarity that often is intentionally fraught by the party state. It allows people to practice decision-making in a group. That is not very difficult that is very difficult if you have never actually done kind of democratic decision-making before. So these are, episodes of hope in China that will echo from now to, later. We see during the protest, one of the protesters were asked why was he there? And he said, because it's my duty, which is a beautiful echo to, of course, one of those famous clips from 1989 when the protester was also asked why he was going to Tiananmen Square, and he also said it was his duty. So I think that it is important to look at China with a longer frame. And to understand that, is a difficult battle that people are definitely fighting. As to what will happen to the organizers of the protest, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think that so far the reporting, of course, there have been arrests, there have been interrogations, there have been phone tracking of people in different cities, suggesting that the authorities will clamp down on, kind of essentially punish people for going to the protest. But what I find actually even more interesting is actually, I think we haven't seen the worst of it yet, because we know how brutal the Chinese government can be, or that there is some kind of in the back, some kind of discussion or perhaps paralysis of some form among the governments about what to do. So now I think both Sheena and Xiao Qiang have essentially said that I think the surveillance state have somehow failed. I wonder whether or not kind of the decision-making hierarchy or the processes within the Chinese government essentially kind of did it actually fail in kind of preventing or in punishing the protesters going forward, or was that somewhat of a success? Because in some ways, they have now, as far as we can see right now, a relatively lighter touch. They have responded to the protesters' demand. They have not rode the tanks in like they did in 1989. So in some ways, things may have, evolved compared to them. Was it the result of these decades of practice cracking down on protests big and small? I think that all remains to be seen. Of course, that doesn't take away the fact that protesters themselves are scared, and that I think the effect of intimidation is very much there. I do wonder just what is going on behind the scene among government officials in discussions of what is their lesson learned with handling the protests.
Yeah, and Sheena and Xiao Qiang, do you have any responses to the points that Maya raised?
Sheena, why did you say that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in, although I'm broadly in agreement with a lot of the points that Maya has raised. I think there's kind of an interesting question here about what you use as a standard for success, and in some ways that's the wrong question, I think, to ask about what's going on with these protests. I think my own read of this is that Maya's right, the state has used a relatively lighter hand. In part, I think, though, that's because it knows that it has the capability to identify these people and deal with them in a much more targeted way behind the scenes later or in between these evening vigils and protests. And we've already seen some evidence of that happening. So I think we have to remember, when we look at public protest and we look at the behavior of the security forces at public protest, that there's a great deal of repressive work or of the party state managing social unrest and potential instability that occurs in places that are invisible to us and that we can't see. And in some ways, the project that Xi Jinping has embarked on in the last 10 years is actually to try to shift much more of the party state's work of social control to those individualized, targeted, private spaces that we can't see, and out of the kind of public sphere and the protest areas that we've seen in the past week. So again, I agree with Maya. I don't think this is probably considered a resounding success for local public security bureaus and internal security officials. But I also think that the state, the state has and then the local security forces have a lot of capabilities that they can bring to bear. And although we see the people protesting, showing incredible courage and really doing things, I agree with Xiao Qiang that these are different. There are many qualities of this wave of protests that are different and important. But I think we have to remember that what we see taking place in public and at these protests is only one piece of the story, and maybe not the most important part of the party state's response. That said, even if the state maintains control, it's possible that what will happen is that dissatisfaction remains, or that, the party state has fixed this specific policy, but the realization that citizens seem to have expressed of the arbitrariness of state authority, of the fact that the state can put you at risk by confining you to your home, may extend beyond zero COVID. That's, we've certainly seen people articulate in the protest that there's something more fundamental at issue that they're concerned about here. And so it's possible that even if the party state successfully makes this tactical adjustment on zero COVID and people go home, that the sort of distrust of the party state and the party state saying, look, we're doing this for you, right? Zero COVID this is our way of keeping China safe. If you fundamentally undermine trust in that narrative, then those effects may linger below the surface for a long time, even if they don't manifest as more protest and public dissent for some time to come. So I think I again broadly agree with so much of what Maya had said. I just wanted to flag for folks who are listening that there's a good portion of this story that is going to play out and probably is already playing out in places and political spaces in China that we can't see, and that is in fact a very deliberate part of the party state strategy for managing these issues.
Thank you, Sheena.
I agree. I'll use the word cold revenge. That's what's party going to take. Not so visible, but they will go after everyone that they have a capacity. But I also want to point out something we haven't touched upon, which is come me a big surprise. Not actually the demonstration in Beijing and Shanghai and Chengdu and Zhengzhou, but across 80 university campuses, the young generation. People don't know China enough, familiar to know how tight the university campus students under the restriction, under control, political control after the 89. They're almost impossible for the young people, the students, to organize themselves again. Much, even in a minor case reasons, much less for the political one. But this young generation are different. Even their parents have barely no memories of 1989. They grow up in a relatively, rich China and economically a lot of prosperities, and they had hope China is more and more open to the world until in the last 10 years, particularly the last 3 years. Let's not forget that. Not only these students were confined in an apartment, lost their college life for 3 years straight, not only because that they have a very dark prospect for the employment because of Chinese down economy of them, they also really, really see Xi Jinping is taking China to the wrong direction. And if he wants to be a lifelong leader, that means in the next 10, 20, 30 years, they don't have the future because Xi Jinping taking China to the opposite direction that they would like to be. This last sort of hope is the final touch that they have to up against him. It's the political one. It's not even just about, I want to get out of my apartment and I want to go to the party and I want my life back, or even I want employment. They target on this one person, rightly so, because unlike the previous Chinese leaders of Hu Jintao or even Deng Xiaoping starts, they are in general, even it's a repressive country, it's a Communist Party dictatorship, but it's bringing China generally more open to seemingly a right direction until Xi Jinping last 10 years, until particularly the COVID last 3 years. If we said what's been blown away, the trust, it's a big lie of Xi Jinping just put himself as a leader of people. Yeah, well, people now to say no. Right, you are not doing that for the people. You are making people suffering. You don't even care about the economy. You don't even care about how the world looks at China. All you care is about preserving your power lifelong. And people see that through, finally, they expressed it. So what I call is a breach of the big silence. That's transformed people's consciousness. Even on the surface, that will be quiet. The party has enough, Xi Jinping has enough resources to allocate, to suppress. But this change of consciousness is also fundamentally changed some kind of a relationship in a very psychological way between Xi Jinping and the people he rules. It's not just people afraid of Xi Jinping. Now Xi Jinping has to afraid of the population that he's going to rule in the next indefinite time. And this is why China is different than a few weeks ago.
Got it. And thank you all so much for your perspectives. I want to ask one more question about the nature of the protests, and then I'm going to pivot a little bit to us talking about more of the China and the world perspective, or how we should kind of think about what's going on in China in an international perspective. So Maya, I'm going to direct this question at you. Some observers have pointed out that many of the organizers and leaders of the protests were young women, and this is kind of speaking to a little bit more of the fundamental issues at play that we've been kind of talking about, characterizing the protests. And in our own studies of Chinese social media, some of the most heavily censored topics, as much, if not more so even than COVID-related topics, includes news of violence against women and gender disparities. So are there some gender dynamics to this public activism that we need to understand?
Absolutely. I mean, in China, as in many other parts of the world, we did see generally empowerment, especially in the form of education, but in China too, is also access to employment in the last decades. Women become more vocal in activist circles over time. But at the same time, in recent years, also in China and around the world, we see whether it is in countries which saw democratic backsliding or deepening authoritarianism, that women are essentially kind of like people who are LGBT individuals, kind of considered as a symptom of whether or not you're talking about kind of modernity or kind of Western influences. Their vocalness and their equality are a problem in these countries, considered by these government officials, are problems that need to be essentially stuffed back into their places. Now, it's really hard once people have gained that power to kind of take away that power. We see that in the US as well. And so women around the world really have played essential roles in organizing, protest organizing to push back against erosion of their rights everywhere. And I think that is a force to be reckoned with. Now, Xi Jinping, since he came to power in 2013, actually did target feminist movement in China as he narrowed or cracked down on civil society. Very early on, a group of young women known as Feminist Five were arrested and I think briefly detained for several months. And that was big news, also because women, they were university students or graduates, and they were organizing these increasingly visible protests focused on women's rights, particularly domestic violence. So that was 10 years ago. And I think that laid the groundwork for women later on who made up the bulk of these protests today. As a matter of their mentality has changed. Their minds have been transformed by these ideas laid by their forebears before them. And you can't really undo them. And in a way, I think Xiao Qiang is also right in saying that if your young people are rising up and their minds have been opened to different possibilities, so different ways of framing the world, it's really hard to kind of stuff them back. And so, I mean, of course, the party had done that in the past. But in the past, again, I think in 1989, there was the promise of economic takeoff. There was like the promise that if you don't do this, we'll give you something else. I think this promise is not quite the same now with the economy essentially slowing down. So I would say that the impact of, women will continue to play a great role in China's democratic movement, I guess. But, to say that is not to say that this is anything really new, because to me, having seen several different movements in the world, I often think women are the unsung heroes who actually organize, who actually make the flyers, who actually make sure people turn up and maintain order in these protests. So the presence of women and the participation is really often the central muscle that keeps these movements going in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Maya. And you provide a nice powerful segue to the next portion of our questions, which will focus more on kind of the internal-external relationship. So Sheena, I'd like to direct this question to you. You've published a lot of field-leading work on how China thinks about its internal security, for example, how it views social stability and political unrest, and its influence abroad. So can you explain this relationship for us and, in your view, what the dynamics are with that?
Yeah, so again, I think this event or set of events has the potential to have some really interesting long-term impact on how China is viewed as a sort of global supplier of a very particular type of security. And what I mean by that is that China has, over the course of the past 5-ish years, really increased its provision of both surveillance technology, but also has started to offer police training. Sometimes coupled with the provision of surveillance technology for policing purposes, but sometimes just offering to train police officers. And if you look at sort of some of the internal discourse of the public security officials and the political legal apparatus, there have been discussions about adopting a global vision for national or for state security work. There have been discussions about sharing the experience of building a safe China and offering it as a model to countries who are interested, not necessarily imposing the model by force, but certainly offering and sharing lessons, capability, and tools. And that's both the technology, the actual surveillance technology piece of it, but also increasingly the offer to train police officials. So we've seen things like the Lianyungang Forum. We've seen things like the offer that Xi Jinping made under the auspices of the Global Security Initiative over the summer to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to train 20,000 police officers. And so we are increasingly seeing that China is at least offering these tools and these lessons to the world. And the sort of message is, if there's domestic instability, if there's high crime, if these are non-traditional security threats in Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept, and the idea or the pitch is China can make these things safer, can create stability. We're in an unstable world, Right? And there's obviously, an attempt to present these in as benign and sort of constructive a way as possible as governance rather than repression. But what's really interesting about that, we don't always have a good sense of how successful that pitch has been. Sometimes it's been temporarily effective, and then the technology hasn't worked as well as it's been promised. And so there have been questions raised about the efficacy of Chinese surveillance exports for actual public safety in the global in various parts of the global South. But what's interesting is that, China's ability to sort of sell this solution or this set of solutions, whether that's police training, Chinese style training of police with Chinese characteristics, or it's the export of Chinese surveillance technology for public security, really depend on sort of the demonstration of efficacy in domestic politics in China, right? That's where China can point to as a proof of concept and say, look, these technologies or this training works. Look what we've been able to do. China is so safe. We can teach you how to manage domestic instability. Remember that often there, the governments that they're offering these trainings and capabilities to are either not democratic or sort of weak democracies with, uneven governance capabilities. And so I think there's an interesting question here about how the protests and the world's view of the protests will affect China's current trajectory and its current efforts to market itself as a supplier of that type of global security capability. My read is that China is really trying to position itself as a security partner of choice to particular countries, but it's doing so by offering internal security capabilities, which the United States has often been pretty nervous about offering or assisting with, in part because of valid democracy concerns over the impact on democracy, freedom, and human rights. And so China is sort of, move to be a global security supplier in that particular space has been notable to me over the course of the past 5 years. But the protests and how successful China is at constraining and managing the protests without high costs and lots of ugly, visible repression will not only have an impact on the domestic dynamics, but I think also on China's reputation as a supplier of global security. And so I think that's very much something to watch in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, fascinating. And Xiao Qiang, in your view, what changes do you think we'll see in this kind of the next phase of Chinese internet censorship, and in this context of globally rising digital authoritarianism?
Well, I agree a lot of what just Sheena said, and I think another panelist, Maya, have done excellent work to expose the China surveillance apparatus and also its global expansion. But coming to the internet censorship itself, yes, I did say that they temporarily being overwhelmed and breached. But yes, it can be restored, and it'll be up to the high gear because I'm trying to say Xi Jinping now is being scared. He is an insecure one. He's an unwelcome emperor of China. Not only unwelcome by its people, but it's also unwelcome almost by his party. So he can only rely on the brutal repression. He's also a brutal one. And don't forget, he's a powerful one. China, after all, the GDP is about the same size or a little bit less at the same scale of the United States. But that wealth, giving that totalitarian regime, it can be easily used and allocated to any repressive machines or buy people off, or Xi Jinping have so much resources can use. Even he failed his economic policy, he failed his international relations, he failed even this zero COVID. He need to deliver something to Chinese people to shift this attention. That I'm afraid he's also a dangerous dictator. That shift of attention could be pointing to Taiwan. That would be easily can be imagined. To galvanize the nationalism, to gain the loyalty of his party. And that will be something when he's desperate. And that'll make China's relationship with the world immediately drastically different. even in the short term. I'm not even speaking about a long term. Short term meaning, in the coming years, or maybe 5-10 years. I'm afraid that we have to pay a great attention on any development on this front.
Great, absolutely. And as this is a forum that brings together governments and civil society stakeholders to think about, the future of democracy, of the internet, of democratically aligned technologies. And I'd open this up to all the panelists. What, in your view, is something that you would want the audience here watching at StratCom to take away from our discussion? What is kind of a key takeaway in your view in this discussion that would be useful for the audience to kind of come away with?
I can start. I think it is to always remember, and I think this get lost along the way in the last 20 years, is how many people in China want and desire democracy and human rights, and not to lose sight of them and to speak to them. I think why I'm saying this got lost is because I think the last 20 years, we see a lot more kind of Western leaders essentially kind of perhaps feeling that the nationalistic aspects of the Chinese population. And I'm not saying that nationalism and a desire for democracy can't actually overlap. But I do think that when Western governments are formulating policies in recent years, they tend to forget that, people in China, are also in a contentious environment. They are also kind of debating or have different views on these issues. So I think keeping them in mind in formulating policies, and it's hard to elaborate on how that would be done in this short time frame, but keeping them in mind would be an important takeaway for this session. Another thing I really want to say is that I don't know how the rest of your day is going to shake out, but I think there's often this perception or this argument that is essentially the West or democracies versus authoritarianism when it comes to digital rights. Now, I and my colleagues in Human Rights Watch who work on technology have really tried to push back against this kind of binary narrative, because what is really happening is the fact that I think both, particularly the US, but also other governments or other forms of technologies originating from democratic governments like I would say Israel, have produced technologies that undermine human rights and sell them to entities and governments that are abusive abroad. Now, what we really need is for governments like the US to clean up their own acts, for example, by putting in place a comprehensive privacy legislation in the US, which would have knock-on effects around the world, but also to rein in these companies that have been shown to be contributing to abuses by, for example, exploring whether or not there should be kind of some form of multinational export control sanction regime on companies that on human rights grounds. Now, we have seen governments like the EU, for example, formulating national or regional digital policies. Some of that are right-centered, but these policies don't extend beyond these borders. We need kind of digital policy that center human rights that can make an impact around the world, that essentially would help people to better express themselves around the world, even though their governments will continue to be repressive. But this is the least, I think, democratic governments can do.
I can jump in. So I think 2 points. One, just to reinforce what Maya said. Across the world, we tend, I think, sometimes to look at things from a maybe a little bit too technologically determinist point of view in terms of their impact on democracy and human rights. And one of the things that I've found that has been really important in looking at the effect of Chinese surveillance technology is that it matters not only what the technology is, and there are real risks to these technologies. Part of the reason I do the research on them is that I think those risks are real and very important to think through carefully. But I don't want us to throw up our hands and say, well, because the technology is out there, there's no way to prevent these negative impacts from occurring. It matters a lot what kind of political model the technology is employed within, and what the regulatory context, what the legal context is, what the sort of political decisions are that constrains the use of the technology and the data that comes from it. And so local, subnational governments, national governments have a lot of power to shape those rules and regulations at the global level, at the national level, and at the subnational level. And all three of those sets of tools are, I think, really important for thinking about how to translate technological capability into effect. I guess one other point that we haven't touched on at all, or at least not much today, that I did want to highlight is that, one of the things that Xi Jinping has done over the course of the last 10 years is in some ways to try to securitize the Chinese diaspora in terms of making stronger claims. And I think some of this language started under Hu Jintao, but it has been sort of more consistently invoked under Xi Jinping. Things like all the sons and daughters of China have an obligation to work for national rejuvenation. Right? That kind of language and claims to be able to police the behavior of Chinese diaspora members, in some cases regardless of citizenship status or geographic location. And what I thought was really interesting and in some ways very powerful about some of these protests was that the protests occurred not only within China itself, but then also globally. On university campuses around the world, outside the embassies in a number of places. And I think that that's a really interesting sort of transnational component, again, probably of concern to the authorities in China. But it was fascinating and inspiring also to see that dimension of the protest. And I suppose I just didn't want to lose sight of that as we switch to the global level, just to note that these were not only a domestic phenomenon inside China, but also had a transnational component or element that I think is just worth making sure we include as we think about their significance.
Absolutely, Sheena, and thank you so much for bringing that up to the discussion. And Xiao Qiang, you have about 4 minutes. I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. I may just re-summarize what I was trying to say, that this white paper movement has said everything that Chinese people finally got to say after 33 years after the Tiananmen massacre, which is Chinese people want democracy, do not want another emperor. And that is a political message. It's not going to realize right away. Even they relax COVID policy, even they crack down all these times, all the protesters, but that desire and demand will continue. That undercurrent will only getting stronger because we heard the voice of the Chinese youth. Another thing I wanted to say is this is at the highest point of Xi Jinping's power. And this is also the beginning of the end of his power. From now on, he's much more dangerous dictator of China and for the world too. And we must watch this extremely carefully.
Great, thank you all. I really want to thank our panelists today. You've provided a lot of insights and valuable perspectives on this, as yet still unfolding issue, and have brought some really important historical frameworks and perspectives for us to kind of put this in context. So I just want to thank you all again for your valuable perspectives, and thank you for joining us today.